I'm afraid that Martin Luther King, the radical anti-capitalist who sought a new society with a new system that was designed for the uplift of the poor, and one that would take care of each person's basic need, has become a stranger to us. And what we've been left with, I'm afraid, is Martin Luther King, you know, the non-threatening Georgia preacher who was best known for making speeches that were inspiring in tone, but, you know, had little to no political substance or critical analysis. And for folks who wish to keep alive the spirit of King, for people who endeavor to incorporate his thoughts, his words, and ideas into all different kinds of areas of struggle, we have to ask ourselves, how does this happen? How does such a towering figure in our history go from enemy of the state to darling of the status quo? Why is it necessary for Martin Luther King Jr., the supreme disciple of peace, to be remade in the image and likeness of the society that he said was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today? One revolutionary said, "During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice, the most furious hatred, and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. After their death, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons." So, in order to answer these questions about King within that context, I think it's best that we begin at the end. In 1968, we know that Martin King went to Memphis, Tennessee to stand with 1,300 black sanitation workers who were striking. They were striking because they were protesting poor treatment and low wages. I mean, these were men that had no protective gear or uniforms. They had to carry large metal bins on their head if they wanted to throw trash away. They were called boy regularly by their white co-workers and supervisors. They had no sick leave, no paid holiday, no insurance. And for these indignities, they were rewarded with the hefty sum of $1.04 an hour, which today is about $7.06. And just to put that in perspective, the national minimum wage in America today is $7.25. So in almost 50 years, the working people of Tennessee haven't even made 2 whole dimes worth of economic progress. And if we look at different states around the country, we see similar trends. Another thing that was happening is that the mayor of Memphis at the time, a cat by the name of Henry Loeb, was very hard on working folks. And they had these sanitation trucks, a lot of which were in poor working condition, but Loeb wouldn't take them out of service. And not only that, he would not pay overtime to the men who were forced to work overtime. And this abuse had been going on, of course, for a long time. It was essentially, de jure abuse. But the breaking point came on a rainy day in February of 1968. Matter of fact, it was the 1st of February in 1968, when 2 men named Echo Cole and Robert Walker, they're black sanitation workers, they were told that they could not stand inside the office with their white co-workers and managers to shield themselves from the rain. So they decided to use an old tactic that the black sanitation workers would use, and they decided to seek shelter in the back of one of the sanitation trucks. Well, there was a short in the truck's wiring, and the compactor that was in the truck went off, and these men were crushed to death immediately. And their families got no workers' compensation or anything like that. And the death of Cole and Walker really symbolized the intersection of racism and economic exploitation that was the daily living reality for black sanitation workers in Memphis at that time. It was racism in the workplace that put them in the truck, And it was the city administration's complete disregard for the plight of the poor that turned this work vehicle into a death trap. And King's involvement in Memphis at this time with organizing boycotts and marches, this was a part of a larger thing he was doing at the time called the Poor People's Campaign. And this was something that he launched back in 1967 during the SCLC conference. And what King wanted to do, he wanted to organize 2,000 working class and poor people and wanted to actually descend on the National Mall and build an encampment and stay there until officials and lawmakers and politicians were willing to come out and discuss new policies and new legislation that would bring about fair treatment and fair wages. And one of the most progressive tactics used in this thrust was the Economic and Social Bill of Rights, which I really don't think a lot of us know enough about. And this Economic and Social Bill of Rights had 6 central points. Number 1, they wanted a guaranteed wage for working people, a living wage. And not only did they just want a living wage, they wanted the wage to be fixed in such a way to where it would rise with the cost of living and the gross national product. Secondly, they wanted jobs established as a right. And to take that a step further, King was demanding that Congress pass an Emergency Employment Act that would create 250,000 career path jobs. Right? Third, they wanted the right to decent housing. They wanted a right to quality education. They wanted access to health care. And they wanted the right to participate in a political decision-making process, which of course, as we know, is just self-determination. And from this document, we can clearly see that King didn't just intend to use moral suasion to achieve his goal. But instead, he wanted to use his own moral conviction to develop a solution where poor working people were given the tools and the resources necessary to develop themselves to their full human potential, while also creating a solution that necessitated their full inclusion. Right? Because as we know, if you are excluded from a system, from a decision-making process, how can you ever receive any justice from it? Now, when we talk about engaging in this political decision-making process, what we're really talking about is the ability to make life and death decisions, right? And this is a central and imperative need for any truly free people. If you do not have the ability to decide the fate of yourself, your family, and your community, then you are not free. Really that simple. Now, consider that in America today, there are about 47 million people living below the poverty line. And what that means is they only make about $24,000 a year, I think a little less, and that's for a household of 4. And I think it's estimated about 18 million people are living near the poverty line. Now, when we talk about these issues about wages and jobs, we know that we're facing some of those same things right here in the district, right? I mean, all the time, that's what you hear: raise the wage, housing. And I'm wondering, can anyone in here tell me what a housing wage is? Anyone know that language? That's getting into some. Okay. Well, essentially. Okay. Yeah. Essentially, a housing wage is the amount of money a household has to make so that they can afford housing without paying more than 30% of the income on housing. So essentially, it just means the amount of money you have to be able to make to afford housing, right? And the housing wage in the District of Columbia is $28.25 for your average market rate apartment, which I think is about $1,469, right? The minimum wage in the District of Columbia is $8.25. So we see that poor and working people literally cannot afford to live here. Now, it's important then and apparent that we need, a similar thrust with King's Economic and Social Bill of Rights, both locally and nationally. And we must know that real economic justice will never come from the kindness of the hearts of the wealthy elites, right? Nor is it ever going to come from the empty promises and uninspired speeches of politicians. King believed, as we believe today, that the only way true economic justice is going to come about is with a massive readjustment of America's economic policy, and further than that, really a complete restructuring of American society. To put it in his words, you can't talk about solving the economic problem of the Negro without talking about billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending the slums without first saying profit must be taken out of the slums. We are treading difficult water because it really means that we are saying that something is wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. On a few occasions in this Bill of Rights, King makes reference to the fact, and this is something, of course, we know that goes on today, that America always seems to have enough money to engage in war and conflict, right? I mean, the coffers just overflow. But when it comes to spending money to make life more manageable for its most downtrodden people, the national pockets, without fail, always go flat. King in this document pointed out that in the post-World War II era, President Truman committed 3% of the gross national product to the Marshall Plan. That's 17 billion American dollars used for the rebuilding of Europe. And King proposed that we should have a similar plan here, right? And just to be clear, when I say $17 billion, I'm not adjusting that for inflation, so I mean $17 billion then, right? So, and the last part of this document is dedicated to criticizing America's foreign and military policy and making the statement that wealth spent on conflict abroad was the cause of misery and want right here at home. Publicly, King will talk about how it cost America about $500,000 to kill each foreign soldier, but only spent about $53 for every person classified as poor. And most of that money went to pay people who weren't poor themselves. And King said that increasingly I began to see war as an enemy of the poor. That's the way he put it. He believed it was an enemy of the poor because clearly this was taking resources away from people who already had very little. King knew that the same system that subjugated people in foreign lands was subjugating poor black and brown communities in a nation that fancies itself as the paragon of democracy. And he also understood that America's negligence of its downtrodden people was directly responsible for the explosion of uprising and rebellions that were happening all across the country at that time. And this posed a dilemma for him personally. And King talked about the difficulty he had in the northern ghettos trying to spread his philosophy about nonviolence. Because when he would, try to assert that, this was the way to achieve justice, the young people would say, well, what about Vietnam? They would make the point that America was using violence to achieve its ends abroad, so they intended to do the same thing to achieve their end right here at home. And, in talking about this, I can't help but think of those folks who criticized the young people of Ferguson, Missouri, who rose up in rebellion after the murder of Mike Brown by Officer Darren Wilson and the fact that jury failed to indict him. So before America can judge the people of Ferguson for expressing their frustration at constantly having their lives devalued and cast aside, they need to ask, what about Palestine? What about Palestine that is and has been occupied by a vicious, racist, settler colonial state of Israel? What about Iraq and Iran? What about Syria? Without a doubt, the United States remains, as King called it then, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And when you consider that Ferguson, Missouri is a place that is 67% black, with an unemployment rate that's over 13%, where the number of poor people doubled between 2010 and 2012, and where right now 1 in 4 people live beneath the poverty line, it's no wonder that this place became such an epicenter of inspiration for rebellion and resistance. Now, finally, we have to ask ourselves, of course, what is to be done? Or as King himself might say, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? How can we get involved? Well, during this MLK holiday weekend, we have joined many others to proclaim it to be a time of protest and resistance, and have helped to organize dramatic street actions throughout the country. In cities all across America, there have been and will continue to be speak-outs, visibility, outreach, and contingents in the Martin Luther King Jr. parades and walks. Through Dr. King, and as been said before, we know that his birthday was actually yesterday, the 15th, but the official holiday is the 19th. So yesterday, during his birthday, we had some folks gather at about 7 a.m. and march through downtown and shutting down major intersections through morning rush hour. In New York City, as we attempted to see earlier, activists took this message into the subways and onto the trains. In Newark, New Jersey, airport workers, organized by SEIU 32BJ, used the day to demand raises and to also demand that Monday be observed as a holiday. So clearly they understand that what better day to demand raise and wage than on the anniversary of a man who also fought for fair wages. Actions are continuing throughout the weekend and on Monday. In San Francisco, there will be a speak out tomorrow, followed by an outreach activity on the train and buses. On Monday, there will be a mass march against the racist wars at home and abroad. In Philadelphia, there will be the Martin Luther King Day of Action, Resistance, and Empowerment. And in Seattle, there will be a Fight for Your Rights in 2015 Martin Luther King Day March and Rally. There have been and will continue to be Reclaim MLK Day events in Chicago, Atlanta, and other cities. We'll be marching in parades from San Francisco to Los Angeles to Chicago to right here in DC. We're also very proud to have been a part of the DC Ferguson movement, which first organized last summer. And we've been helping out organizing a campaign around the Jump Out Squads, which is the Metropolitan Police Department's sort of ramped up version of Stop and Frisk. And just for anyone who may not know what that is, just picture yourself, walking along the street minding your business, and 3 or more police pull up in an unmarked car, jump out without uniforms on, but with weapons drawn, toss you on the ground, search you, not find anything, get in their car, don't write any report, and they speed off. And our illustrious sheriff, Kathy Lanier, calls this a fantasy, right? So not only is this blatant disregard for our rights, it's also an insult to our intelligence. Now we're not even smart enough to know we're being abused, right? So where that 74% approval rate came from. Anyway. We know today, after the killings of Mike Brown, Aaron Garner, Tamir Rice, Akai Gurley, Ezell Ford, and so many others, we've been noticing this slew of racist police killings of unarmed people who received no justice by the same system that Dr. King condemned years ago. The growing movement against racism and police terror needs to reclaim the radical tradition of one of its most brilliant leaders. We know that this country needs a sustained movement to really achieve the goals of such a thing. And the Party for Socialism and Liberation is committed to helping make that happen. So when we remember Dr. King, we should remember him, as someone who was attempting to connect the various forms of oppression into a single struggle for social justice. That was the community he was talking about. And the only way to remove injustice is to remove the foundation from which the injustice springs. And that foundation is capitalism. So let us remember this through the Civil Rights Revolution. That's what it was. And we should remember him by talking about what it's going to take to really make that revolution happen, to achieve what it was Dr. King was trying to achieve. Because you have Martin Luther King, a man who above all else was motivated by love and brotherhood and a sincere desire for justice and equality. And then you have capitalism, a justice that is designed for divisiveness and destructiveness and exploitation. And in my opinion, King's very nature raged against capitalism. It was an affront to everything he believed in. He understood that the only way for justice to prevail is for the system that not only breeds injustice but needs injustice to exist is destroyed. So if we're serious about making that happen, if we're serious about honoring the legacy of Dr. King and trying to bring some of his progressive ideas into fruition, then we have to be serious about the work of destroying the system that he has so much disdain for. Okay? And the last thing I'll say to you, in the words of Fred Hampton and Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, peace if you're willing to fight for it, and let your motto be resistance. Thank you.